So I'll start with something really basic. I'll have a look at what actually is the homelessness system in Australia. It's defined by a number of national agreements. They set this funding context and circumscribe homelessness service provision, and these are include the MPAR, the NAHA, and the AHURI. Beneath the national context in each state, there is an overarching strategy that organises the homelessness service system, and beneath that, of course, are the individual specialist homelessness services that provide the range of services to support homeless people. So when I sort of started looking at this, I suppose I went at this fairly naively, and I thought, oh yes, of course there's a national homelessness service system, but when I thought about it a little bit more, I realised that while the contractual arrangements such as the MPAR and the NAHA frame the homelessness services system, the fact that each state has its own particular strategy and vision really means that there's a separate kind of homelessness service system within each state that caters to particular target groups more or less, or addresses certain needs more or less. So I don't think we can really talk about an Australian homelessness system. We have to keep in mind that there are significant differences between the states and the territories. So then the next question is around how do we know whether the homelessness service system is effective, and that's where it's worthwhile looking at, what do the agreements say, what are the goals? So in Australia, the Road Home, for example, sets out that we're looking to achieve a reduction in the number of homeless people. So that's one way of looking at it. But in other countries, for example, in Canada and USA, some areas use the concept of functional zero, which really means that the systems there are set up to respond to people who become homeless as they become homeless, and nobody remains homeless for long. So it's not a situation where nobody is homeless, but it's a situation where the local communities and the services are able and equipped to deal with the amount of people that come in needing homelessness services and provide them with the assistance that they need. So that's another goal that one can set themselves. And then I think if one would ask a person on the street, how do you think we should define success in dealing with homelessness? I think very often people would say, well, it would be if there is no one homeless. So that might be another goal. Whether that's realistic or achievable, that's another question. But I just want to put that out there so we can see that there are different kinds of levels that one can aim at in looking at whether the homelessness service system is effective. And I think the goals that one set oneself also define the kind of policies and the kind of strategies that one would use to achieve that goal. And so I just want us to keep in mind that in Australia we're looking to reduce homelessness rather than produce functional zero or absolute zero, although I'm sure no one would be unhappy if we achieved any of the latter two. So it's not just the goals that define how policy is shaped, it's also how we talk about what is homelessness. So in Australia, and this is primarily from the ABS definition of homelessness, we talk about a person as being homeless if their dwelling is inadequate, if they have no tenure or their initial tenure is short and not extendable, or if their place of residence does not allow them to have control of and access to space for social relations, including a sense of security, stability, privacy, safety, and the ability to control living space. So homelessness is not the same as rooflessness. There are other ways of looking at it as well. I think commonly people also refer to primary homelessness, which is rough sleeping, secondary homelessness, which is people in various forms of temporary shelter, and tertiary homelessness, which is people in very inadequate housing, for example, such as in boarding houses and caravan parks. Now, I want to offer to this, again, an example from Canada, another definition of homelessness, and I think this one is interesting because it's much broader. It refers also to some of the causes of homelessness. And it says, homelessness describes the situation of an individual or family without stable, permanent, or appropriate housing, or the immediate prospect, means, and ability of acquiring it. And I think this is the important bit here where it says that it is a result of systemic or societal barriers, a lack of affordable and appropriate housing, the individual household's financial, mental, cognitive, behavioural or physical challenges, and or racism and discrimination. It also acknowledges that most people do not choose to become homeless and that it's a very distressing situation. And it also notes that it describes a variety of housing circumstances. And again, I put that definition up there because I think the way we define homelessness, the way we set our goals, and the way we talk about it defines the kind of policies and the kind of objectives we have about dealing with homeless people. So in the Australian context, if we have a look at the kind of indicators of system effectiveness, depends not just what we want to look at, but also the kind of data we have available. So if we are aiming for a reduction in the number of homeless people, obviously we have to look at a reduction in the proportion or number of homeless people. So that's one of the indicators I chose to look at. Also the system's ability to deal with the number of homeless people who seek to access it. So we're looking at system capacity and unmet demand as another indicator. A reduction in the number of people repeatedly accessing the homelessness services system, and I think that's important to ensure that we know whether or not the services are effectively meeting people's needs. So if somebody comes in, receives a service and then just keeps on coming in, that would indicate that the services are not effective in the way that they should be. There's also great interest in client outcomes beyond housing. Housing, of course, is one of them, but also there's great interest in client outcomes in relation to education, training and employment, and of course social inclusion. Another indicator relates to the targeting of priority groups, the prioritisation of early intervention and prevention, and I think that's a discussion that's been going on for some time now. Are we moving from a crisis-driven system to a system that includes early intervention and prevention as well? Issues around system integration with other services, and of course cost effectiveness. There are a number of other indicators that one could use, of course. For example, the number of program and housing units against estimated demand. I didn't use that because we don't have data on that, or I couldn't get my hands on that data. One could look at the number of people who successfully exit into permanent housing. One could look at things like the new people who are new to homelessness into the system from at-risk populations, or a number of other ones. But the ones that I've listed here are the ones that I'm going to be talking about in some more detail. So how can we find the answers to these questions? So of course there's census data, which gives us some information around homelessness and its prevalence. The problem with the census data is that it's not very current at the moment. We've just had the new census, but the data is not available yet. There's the Specialist Homelessness Services Collection that runs annually, which gives us very good data on people who access the homelessness services system, but the problem there, of course, is it doesn't capture people who don't access the system. There are numerous state and territory evaluations of NPAR-funded programs. There are also independent evaluations of NPAR-funded programs, state and territory auditor general reports, state and territory annual reports, and various research papers from Australian and international researchers will give us a picture of the homelessness system in Australia. But I'd say that the quality of the evidence base is fairly variable. There's limited evidence on system effectiveness. Most studies are either not independent, or they look at individual services, or they're locally targeted, or they involve only a small number of services. So there's actually fairly limited evidence on the performance of the system nationally. As I said, the quality of the evidence can be variable. It's not necessarily always timely, and the availability of the data is often limited, and it can be very fragmented so that we don't really get those cross-comparisons that we might like. So I've put that in a little table here. If we have a look at what is the quality of the evidence base, so this is not the answer to is it happening or not. This is simply looking at the quality of the evidence base. If we're looking at evidence on the number of the reduction of reduction of people who are homeless. I put a question mark here because that's mainly from census data. I'm not saying census data is not reliable, but as I said, it's not necessarily current. There's reasonable data on system capacity and unmet demand. There's good data on the reduction of the number of people repeatedly accessing homelessness services. There's good data on people's housing status, and there's also relatively good data on the targeting of priority groups, and that is all data that comes out of the Specialist Homelessness Services Collection. There's not really good data on prioritisation of early intervention and prevention. Where we have some information about social inclusion outcomes for homeless people, this is not usually available at a national level. It's usually in relation to particular services that are being provided. Again, if we look at education, training and employment participation, we have fairly reasonable data. And on cost effectiveness, we have various studies that have looked at that, but most of those aren't at a national level. So I have to talk a lot faster, says Michael. All right, so I'll run through it really quickly. What does the data actually tell us? If we have a look at the number of the reduction of homeless people, from the census we can see that there hasn't really been a reduction, neither in the actual number of people nor in the proportion of people who are homeless since 2001, and in fact there's been an increase. So I would say that nationally we have not been successful at reducing the number of homeless people. If we have a look at system capacity and demand, we can see that there is a fair bit of unmet demand. So in 2015, 2016, almost 300,000 people were assisted by specialist homelessness services. However, over 100,000 requests were unmet annually. These are people who requested housing or other support services that didn't have their needs met. And 70% of those requests for assistance included requests for assistance for housing. So people accessing homelessness services, asking for housing assistance, and they don't get that housing assistance. So we have a look at what services, what requests were unmet. As I said, short-term and emergency housing is one of the biggest unmet needs. Other housing assistance and specialist services without accommodation are also sometimes unmet needs, but not to the same degree. So if we have a look at the next indicator, has there been a reduction in the number of people repeatedly accessing the homelessness services system? And we can see here from the data that it's actually been pretty stable. So the average number of support periods has not really changed since 2011, with people on average accessing the service system 1.7 times. And you can see here that the majority of people, if you have a look at the first column, the majority of people really only need one support period and then they're good. And only a very small number of people, around 7%, access the system 4 or more times. So these are people who usually have complex needs that require much more assistance. So are we effective in providing housing to people? This is a look at people's housing status before and after they access the services. And we can see here that, yes, there is a small improvement in people's housing situation as a result of accessing homelessness services. But if we look a little bit deeper here, I think this is a really interesting graph because it shows, if you have a look at long-term housing, of all the people asking for assistance with long-term housing, only 5% of those get their needs met. So I think that is very, very telling. Obviously, the system is doing much better in other accommodation groups, such as short-term or emergency housing or medium-term housing. So have a look at, do we provide better education, training and employment participation outcomes? Again, I think the numbers speak for themselves. If we look at people who are in education and training prior to support and post-support, there's not a really big change. As you can see here, for example, in 2015, 2016, 21% of people were enrolled in education and training prior to support, and 21% were enrolled post-support. If we look at the people who had employment as an identified need when they accessed the service, we can see that there's some change, some improvement, but again, probably not as big as one would hope. If we have a look again at 2015, 2016, prior to support, 11% of people were employed and had employment identified needs, and afterwards it was 20%. Now, this is a graph that I've titled Targeting of Priority Groups, but upon reflection, I actually think it's more in relation to who are the groups that access the homelessness system. And we can see here that heavy users are Indigenous people, people with a mental health issue, and the most heavy users are people who are living domestic and family violence. So I'm just moving through these as I've just been given the notice to hurry up. So I'll just say something briefly here about social inclusion. We know that social inclusion and connection and having the right kind of social connections are incredibly important to provide people with pathways out of homelessness. However, we don't have really good data on that. Individual studies show that homelessness services can be very effective in assisting people to become more socially connected and achieve those kind of outcomes. But nationally, we really don't have good evidence on that. So that's probably an area we should be looking at. And just in relation to cost effectiveness, and I know that Paul will be speaking later on, he will probably be able to tell you more about that, but what studies are available do show that homelessness services are very effective, cost effective, and that these savings usually result from cost savings in other areas of the service system, often in relation to health and justice. Okay, so keeping on skipping through all this. Okay, so if we have a look at the evidence all up, we can see that the picture's a little bit fuzzy. So nationally, the reduction in the number of homeless people are pretty unclear, but I think from the census data, it's fairly clear it's not happening. I'm just put unclear because it's not yet current. If we look at in terms of system capacity, has it improved? Well, no, it hasn't really. There's no change. Same when we look at people repeatedly accessing the homelessness system, there's been no real change. There's a small improvement in people's housing status, but as I said, long-term housing is a really serious problem. Because only 5% of people receive it. There's no real change in terms of the kinds of people who access it, the priority groups that access the homelessness service system. We don't really know enough about system integration to be able to say whether that's working well. The studies are too fragmented. Again, we're not sure whether they are social inclusion outcomes nationally, how well that's going, how well that's not going. Education and training and employment, there are small improvements, and yes, it is cost effective. But what I found, just to wind up, what I found really interesting in looking at all of this data, I didn't just look at national data, I looked at the individual studies, and most individual studies and most individual evaluations of homelessness programs that I did look at found that the individual programs were very effective on most of these measures that I looked at here. And so the puzzling question here then is, or not the puzzling question, I think the question we really need to look at is, why is it that these individual services are effective, but at a national level, the numbers and the indicators really don't stack up to say that as a system as a whole, like that nationally, we are not effectively addressing homelessness. Okay, thank you very much.